Erasmo Menachem, who is fantastic and who you may remember from the Whole People series, says, take what you need to ground yourself and orient to the here and now, and repeat as needed to be present with us tonight. And with that, we also want to let you know about a few things before we dive into the discussion. So first, this event is being recorded so it can be made available for folks later on. So just want you to be aware of that. Second, we would invite you to join us in turning our cameras on if you're comfortable doing so and have not done so yet. In our experience, being able to see one another can really help facilitate meaningful connection and engagement, as well as a sense of community, even in these virtual spaces. Though whether and how you participate tonight is totally up to you, we would only ask that to avoid audio issues, you keep yourself muted unless you are speaking. And in addition, PBS's Whole People discussion guide is going to be dropped into the chat. It's a really rich companion document to the Whole People series, and we just wanted to share it with you all, knowing that some of you might not have had an opportunity yet to watch the series, might be looking for questions to think about reflecting on. So Robin will drop that in the chat for you, or Cissy. And just to let you know, this conversation officially ends at 8, but the four of us that are hosting tonight anticipate being able to stay back for a few moments afterward, knowing that these have tended to run over a bit because the enriching discussions are just so hard to stop once they get started. Though certainly you may leave whenever works for you. We're so grateful you're with us for this important conversation for any length of time. And finally, we want to provide you with some resources to take care of yourself should you feel that you could benefit from any additional support at all, fully knowing that some topics that we might discuss could be challenging. So some resources will be dropped in the chat, including a brief PDF, as well as some phone numbers and websites by me after we go around and do some very brief introductions of the facilitators and sponsoring organizations. Then we'll let you know a little bit about our very, very special guest who we are so glad to be with tonight, and then we'll get the conversation started. So my name is Whitney Marris. I am representing the National Trauma Campaign tonight, and we are working on educating and activating policymakers around supporting policies, programs, legislation, and appropriations that address trauma and build resilience across the lifespan. In my day jobs, I am a practicing therapist in Alexandria, Virginia, right outside of the DC metro area, and do include trauma-specific modalities in my practice. And I'm also a project manager with the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care, where I help facilitate organizations and systems planning for, implementing, and sustaining trauma-informed culture change. And that is me. So I will pass this to Erin, our co-host tonight, and I will get those resources into the chat.
First, I have to unmute myself. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Whitney, for passing the baton. My name is Erin Connolly. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, yoga teacher, a Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy Practice board member, and a whole lot of other things that are connected to the world of trauma and resilience and growth. And I'm really excited with our guest tonight, who I will introduce in a few minutes, but I want to pass it off to another co-host. I'm going to go based on my order on my screen. Cissy White, if you could introduce yourself and then pass to Robin, and then we'll come back.
Sure. So I'm Cissy White here representing ACEs Connection, which officially as of today changed names to PACES Connection to focus on positive as well as adverse childhood experiences. We have almost 50,000 members and 400 communities that we work with. And on a personal note, this is my last event with ACEs Connection. I'm going on medical leave for some health things, but I am so excited that this is the event I'm leaving on because I have been inspired by Father Abernathy's work and approach with trauma-informed community development for years. And I'm thrilled to be able to be in conversation and company tonight. I'm very glad to be here. I joined ACEs Connection as a member first, and then leading the parenting with ACEs community. And our focus really was on not about how to parent, but the experience of parents who have experienced trauma and what it is like to parent from that perspective. So we wanted to just have a space that was focused on the parents' experience. And I'm going to hand it over to Robin Cogan, who's also co-hosting this series.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm so happy to be here with my amazing team that we have worked on this Transform ACEs Drama Film Festival. This is our third installment, and we have one more in June. So thank you all for being here. So yes, my name is Robin Cogan. I am a full-time school nurse in Camden, New Jersey. I also teach school nursing at Rutgers University, and I am a blogger. In my spare time, I am also a gun violence prevention activist and work in that space, and also certainly during COVID, being a school nurse is a full-time job dealing with COVID and children and families. So welcome. We're so happy you're here. Father Paul Abernathy, I'm so honored to meet you. I've followed you and appreciate your work. And so we're excited to, I guess Erin is going to introduce you, right?
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Cissy. Thanks, Whitney. And let me echo the sentiments of I'm just so excited to be part of this team, and really looking forward to our discussion tonight with Reverend Paul Abernathy, who is an Orthodox Christian priest and the founding CEO of the Neighborhood Resilience Project. Since 2011, Father Paul labored with the community to build this ministry to address community trauma with trauma-informed community development, a framework that transforms trauma-affected communities to resilient, healing, and healthy communities so people can be healthy enough to sustain opportunities and realize their potential. Under Father Paul's leadership, millions of dollars in food, clothing, furniture, transportation assistance, identification, free healthcare, and emergency relief has been distributed to the Greater Pittsburgh Community. The framework of the trauma-informed community development also includes a trauma response team and micro-community interventions. Community groups from all across the nation have worked with Father Paul to be trained in the TICD Framework. And the best part is Father Paul is one of my co-members of the State Tip Board, and I got to hear Father Paul speak this morning at a kickoff for if anybody that's living in Pennsylvania. United Way of Pennsylvania has now kicked off their resilience work, and so I'm really super excited to just hear from Father Paul. So we'll start, kind of open it up to Father Paul just to share where he's at, what he wants to share around, and then we can come back and talk a little bit more about the connections to the film and anything else that pops up. Please feel free to pop in questions in the chat box, and we'll just keep an eye on them, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to chat. So Father Paul, it's all yours.
Well, firstly, Erin, Whitney, Robin, Cissy, and to all the rest of you, what a great joy and blessing it is to be with you. Just as the meeting began, I can just sense the joy and beauty of this group. And it's a great honor for me to be here with you this evening and to see some very familiar faces who have participated with us over the years. So nice to see all of you. Well, really what to say. I want to begin by acknowledging a certain reality. For so many of our communities across these United States, trauma has been more than just a personal experience. We've got to acknowledge that. For far too long, we've talked about trauma as though it was something that just we experienced as individuals. But I would submit that we are really connected to one another. And when someone with whom we are in relationship, either by personal relation or by virtue of a shared culture, heritage, history, experiences a particular kind of trauma, it affects us. That we must have this understanding of trauma that it goes beyond the personal experience of the individual, but rather this understanding that there is trauma in the context of our relations with one another. That means we must realize the impact of collective trauma. That it's not just about what we've been through, but it is about what also our ancestors have been through. It's not just what we've been through, but what our neighbors and our friends and our families have been through, that all of this really impacts us. It's important also, I would argue, to understand that when we experience trauma as a community, when we experience trauma as a group, that it shapes the narrative of our community. And that from that narrative, a culture emerges. And culture, brothers and sisters, is a very powerful force in our lives. We must understand that so often it is the case that we have particular social behaviors merely because they are the acceptable cultural norm of our society. This is a very powerful driver in our lives. And so for far too many of our communities, life in our communities, the narrative of our community, the culture of our community has been shaped first and foremost by trauma. These traumatic experiences that for some communities really in our nation have had this collective experience of trauma going on for hundreds of years. Many people, all of us, we remember certainly what had happened last summer with the experience of George Floyd and his murder as we watched on our streets. Fascinatingly enough, it reminded me of the murder of Emmett Till, who of course was a 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago visiting his relatives in Mississippi in 1955, not really understanding the norms of the Deep South at that particular time. Emmett Till was eventually, he was kidnapped and he was murdered. Of course, we know this very famous incident. His mother made the decision to have his body, after he had been tortured, thrown in the river, after murdered, his bloated, tortured body, she had made the decision to display him in an open casket for 3 days. We imagine such courage. In those 3 days, John Lewis, the late, great John Lewis, reflected that he, as a young man at that time, saw Emmett Till, that beautiful, beaten and broken boy lying in the casket, and thought to himself, that could have been me. This could be me. And what struck me about the words of the late, great John Lewis is that when George Floyd was murdered, I heard people in my community saying the very same thing. Just as I had heard when Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor or so many others had been murdered, that could have been me. In other words, there are so many of us who, whether or not we realize it, we see ourselves in the other. This is a powerful truth that speaks to the way in which when somebody who reflects us suffers an extreme trauma, we too in some way share in that experience. We too in some way see ourselves in the trauma of the other. So this reality of community trauma, the reality and the impact thereof, has led us in our work with the Neighborhood Resilience Project to consider a term, this idea of trauma-affected community. That there is something that we might refer to as a trauma-affected community. It's more than just someone, but it's an entire community that has a disproportionate experience of trauma that has really shaped the narrative of that community. This idea of trauma-affected community. Now, I'll tell you, in our community in the Hill District, where it's my neighborhood, where I live, where our ministry, where our church is located, in our neighborhood, it's not that everybody has lost a son to gun violence, but everybody knows somebody who has. It's not that everybody's been evicted, but everybody knows somebody who has. It's not that everybody's been incarcerated, but everybody knows someone who has. This is no gross exaggeration. This is the reality for life in our community. This trauma that is disproportionate. It is so widespread that we, whether we have direct experiences or not, certainly have indirect experiences of trauma, and it is all around us. It seems as though it really is the norm, a very serious issue. I remember one day, a few years ago, I had been out with our trauma response team. In this particular homicide, it was a young man in his 20s who was walking on the sidewalk. The shooter pulled up in the car next to him, and as the young man recognized the shooter, must have recognized that his life was in danger, he began to run. And as the shooter opened fire, the young man who he was shooting at ran into the street. He killed the young man. The young man fell into the street, and the shooter drove over his body. And I remember at that particular time, when we arrived with the trauma response team, there was a young man who was about 14 years old who happened just to be walking by at the time. And he witnessed the entire event, and he recounted it to me to the detail, in gruesome detail. But as he recounted it to me, he was completely numb to it. And after he finished, he said to me, "But that's all right. because this is normal. That's a direct quote from that young man. And it struck me how different what he said was than what our young beloved children in Parkland, Florida were saying. We were watching at the very same time these young and beautiful, courageous, strong young children raise awareness in our country and even challenge the laws and norms of our country around guns. Basically, what I heard these children from Parkland, Florida saying is, you have violated your social contract with us. I heard them saying, you have broken your norm. You have violated the norm that we thought we were guaranteed in this society. Whenever that shooting happened in Parkland, Florida, they were saying, this is not normal. But it was so different from what that young man experienced, who was saying, no, this is normal. This is what we mean by a trauma-affected community and the impact that it has on the worldview and the people who hold that worldview in the community. We also know, though, with trauma-affected community, that we have to understand there is an antithesis to a trauma-affected community. If there's such a thing as a trauma-affected community, then truly there must also be a resilient, healing, and healthy community. Now, in this country, community development is very, may I say, problematic. Because we Americans, a lot of times when we talk about community development, we're really only talking about two things. We're talking about real estate and jobs. Generally, the measure of success, and this is just me talking, this is my observation. Generally, the measure of success is profit. It is the bottom line. This is the measure of success. But we know that really, if we consider the impact of trauma and what it really is to be healthy in a community, that we might say the goal of community development, we might say in a better way, the goal of community development is community well-being. Can you imagine if this was what we said? That community development, quite simply stated, is about community well-being. But if this then is the goal, which we pray includes these kinds of opportunities, we have also to understand that so often in the case when people talk about community development, they speak about opportunities. We want to create opportunities to get jobs, opportunities to get housing. But brothers and sisters, I tell you, what good is an opportunity if we are not healthy enough to sustain it? This is what we talk about. We don't just want to create opportunities. We want people who are healthy enough to sustain opportunity. When I came home with my military unit, with my Army unit from the war, we saw in the subsequent months how some young men who didn't have maybe the same resilience as others began to drown their sorrows in alcohol, and they began to act their pain out in physical violence. We saw it, and we saw how they couldn't reintegrate back into society. We saw how so many of them couldn't hold down a job, but nobody accused them of being lazy or ignorant or malicious or stupid. People said, well, they've been through a lot. Now, I will tell you this, since I came home from the war, which was the first time that I ever really heard the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder and began to work in my own community, I will tell you that I believe and have believed for a long while now that I've seen so much more post-traumatic stress disorder in my own community than I ever saw when I was in the Army. So this notion about creating opportunities is a foolish notion. If we do not also recognize the need for healing in order to prepare people to sustain the very opportunities we create. This is a difficult task, and it means that how we engage these communities has to be with great intention, with a focus on how we understand when indeed we are building resilience. I would challenge us, those of us who are doing this work, those of us who are deeply engaged and embedded in this cause, to really beg the question, is it always just about being a trauma expert? There are so many of our communities that have now many trauma experts in our community, but really, where are the resilience experts? And I will tell you, I've learned that it's so often the case that we have resilience experts who are really in these communities. We talk a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, but let us also consider what post-traumatic growth looks like. some of the wisest, some of the strongest, some of the most powerful, beautiful, and profound things that I've ever seen in my life have come from immense suffering. We can say this not only perhaps of our personal experience, but there are so many jewels of humanity that also begin with human suffering. Whether we talk about the Taj Mahal in India or Uncle Tom's Cabin with Harriet Beecher Stowe, so much of it begins with trauma. We must learn how to recognize the growth, the wisdom, the strength that exists in our community as a result of the multi-generational complex trauma that's there. And we must leverage that growth, that wisdom, that strength, using them as an opportunity to build relations, bring people together, which is one other thought I just might share. Our community, people sometimes they talk about, well, we want to meet with the community. We want to go to a community meeting. And sometimes the answer to that is, well, what community is there? There's no community left. The community has been completely shattered by, yes, violence, shattered by poverty, shattered by brokenness of various kinds, shattered by failed political strategies, shattered by attempted manipulations, shattered by all of this. So much of the work in trauma-informed community development has to begin with the understanding that we've got to build community. And that community, if we understand the necessity of building it, must also be trauma-informed. But you see, brothers and sisters, that's where the opportunity is. Because if we have a chance to organize, not according to some, towards some political end, but if we have a chance to organize in a way that is bent on building resilient, healing, and healthy community, there is a chance to lay a new foundation and reset the culture and narrative of our community. There is a chance to find those who have that strength and wisdom as a result of the trauma and train them and equip them and empower them and send them forth to really do this work as they themselves become empowered healers, community builders, and change makers. There is a chance, brothers and sisters, for us to reframe this understanding of community development to be more encompassing, so that we don't find ourselves simply defining success by the measure of profit, but rather we define success by the health and well-being of those who are living really in those communities. And let me say really this final word, brothers and sisters, before I turn it back over to our beloved sisters here this evening. We are at a crossroads. Now, I watched our cities burn last summer. And our city, like so many others of them, burned as well. I remember one night I was going to the church one Saturday night to open up for a Saturday evening service. But it was just the smoke. It was the smoke coming from the police cruiser that had been set on fire. And we saw our cities burn. And we saw our capital stormed. There's a great pain in this nation that's never been healed. We Americans turn to violence for our answers. We have since the days of our revolution. We have won many victories on battlefields, and it has not healed these wounds. And we have even achieved great political victories in the halls of our government. It has not healed these wounds. These wounds remain with us because we as a nation have not done this work of healing our communities. The protests may be over for now, but there is an undercurrent in America that leaves our future in great question. We must be about the work of healing our nation, lest these wounds fester and become infected, leading to a terrible disease of violence and strife that tears us apart yet again. I have been to Syria twice, in the year 2000 and 2005. And when I was there, nobody would have imagined that just in a few short years, hundreds of thousands would be dead and millions would be displaced by a civil war. We mustn't be naive. Now is our time, and there is no turning back. 2020 has disrupted things, but it may be a beautiful disruption. 2020 has given us the opportunity to reset and move forward in a new way, a way that is more healthy, more healing, more just. 2020 has given us the opportunity to acknowledge the pain of the past and recognize the stress and suffering of so many of our communities. We have to say, brothers and sisters, that even trauma has made many of our communities socially vulnerable. And as a result of this social vulnerability, COVID has been harder in communities that I would argue are trauma-affected communities. We have the inequities, the injustice, the pain, the impact that all of this trauma has on health and well-being in our communities has been exposed. And I say thank God for that. Because now, brothers and sisters, we know. And now that we know, we must be about this great healing work. Our communities need developed. So I say, let us do so. And let us do so in a way that is trauma-informed, that helps us attain that elusive goal of resilient healing and healthy community.
And speaking of thinking about resilient and healthy healing communities, something that really struck me personally in the whole People series was the feature on the Somali Minnesotan folks that I thought really profoundly captured the significance and power of leveraging traditional cultural practices for healing. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the importance of anchoring ourselves in cultural humility, as well as celebrating and lifting up cultural resilience and how these constructs function within the trauma-informed community development framework.
This is such a beautiful question, Whitney. This is one of the areas where obviously in the trauma-informed world, like any other world, there is a great temptation to come into the communities and always seek to introduce something new, when in reality our cultures, as was indicated in the series, our cultures, so many of our cultures have a very rich history in healing. Our cultures have processes for healing. Our cultures have traditions around healing that give us resilience. And sometimes when we try to bring other traditions or other kind of interventions into the community, it's done in a way that undermines the resilience that's actually there. And I will tell you that it is so often the case that the new interventions, the new perspectives, the new attempt to build resilience, even after it undermines the resilience that once there, I've seen also doesn't take hold itself, because it's foreign. Because it's foreign to the people, because it's foreign to their heart. And in the end, they end up with less resilience as a result of this attempt to build resilience. In his divining work on slave religion, one of the foremost experts of American religious history is a religion professor from Princeton by the name of Dr. Al Roboto. And in his defining work on slave religion, he has entitled it The Invisible Institution, talking about the slave church in the antebellum South. And what he means really by the invisible institution is that because in the antebellum South, contrary to popular belief, slaves were not allowed to be baptized according to the law in most counties across the South, nor were they allowed to pray or to pray without white supervision. This we know from historical records. And so as a result, these slave communities embraced the faith on their own and actually developed this church in secret. History knows these as there was this spiritual steal away to Jesus that was actually a signal for slaves to go off from their quarters after they had worked all day long, and they would sneak into the woods, and they would set up in the woods into areas known to history as hush harbors, where they would hold all night vigils before the sun came up so that they would be spiritually strengthened to endure the pain in the fields the very next day. The significant thing is this: these slave owners had no idea that these hush harbors exist. They had no idea that these people had this tradition around prayer, that their practice was a spiritual practice that gave them the resilience to endure that trauma. They had no idea. They had no idea that there were traditions that were emerging right under their nose that they could not see. Now, this Dr. Robideau calls the invisible institution. Now, for us doing this trauma-informed work in communities that perhaps are foreign to our own upbringing, maybe we might ask the question, are there invisible institutions here before us? Certainly they'd be invisible perhaps to us, not certainly invisible to the people who live in these communities. There are incredibly deep and rich historical traditions that so many cultures have around healing that contribute to resilience. Part of the challenge is that from a Western perspective, we have a tendency to emphasize a clinical model. Now, I would also argue this has got us into a little bit of a problem, because we have gotten to a place in our national dialogue, I would say, where people say, people have accepted that it's a clinical answer. But then we also understand that we have nowhere near the number of clinicians we need, if that is indeed the only answer. We know this. There's an extreme shortage of behavioral health clinicians in all of our communities. At the same time, we also know that although these clinical interventions are important and they are valid and they have extreme value, that there are also other kinds of interventions that help us heal from trauma. As we say in the trauma-informed realm, you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. Whenever we enter into dialogue with communities, the thing that really I would encourage us to really reflect on is, where are the therapeutic interactions? Now, in our work, in trauma-informed community development, we've learned to use that terminology. We use that terminology with certainly the folks that we train from the community. We certainly use that terminology in our own internal reflection, and we want to teach people in the community that terminology, because what we want to know is, was this a therapeutic interaction, or where did you have the therapeutic interaction? Really fascinating set of research that I heard about, or a case study actually on the Branch Davidian children. Many of us remember David Koresh. Not everybody remembers, of course, some of us remember David Koresh, of course, the Branch Davidians, and we might remember that as part of the negotiation, the children were released first. Of course, many of the adults died in the fires as the compound was burned to the ground. But before that happened, the children were released. They were heavily traumatized. And at that particular time, the federal authorities, as I understand it, made arrangements for the children to be actually handed over to behavioral health specialists. But these behavioral health specialists realized, in entering into these children and working with these children that had been suffering under extreme trauma, that they, and also in a cult culture, these children would not open to clinical interventions. They would not interact with these clinicians. So what they did was, they put these children in sort of a day room setting, and they put like different things around, crayons, paper, toys, these types of things, Play-Doh, these types of things. And they put the clinicians in the area. And children would draw something, and then they'd come over to a clinician, they'd say something, and they'd say something quite profound about these particular drawings. And this went on for a period of about 2 weeks. They started timing these interactions. They went between, as I understand it, anywhere between, I think, 30 seconds, 2 minutes, or even maybe up to a few minutes past that, maybe 7 minutes. But really, it was very, very short. And in the end, they found that on average, these children were spending 2 hours a day having therapeutic interactions with these clinicians. Now, this is very fascinating, because if we think outside of a very strictly defined clinical intervention, and we think more broadly in terms of therapeutic interaction, we quickly find that the capacity for healing and resilience building in our communities increases exponentially almost immediately. And this is where we can begin to leverage those invisible institutions that are already doing this work and yet do not have the language for it. If we're able to give language for this, it becomes very important. If we're able to recognize this, it becomes very important. It's funny because sometimes people, they want, I've seen it they come to the communities and I see them, they talk to people about, mindfulness and yoga. And of course, I'm not knocking those things, but what happens is they talk to people as though they're introducing something that really, I've come to bring something new to you. You people don't know this, so I'm coming to bring something new to you. But in reality, these people for generations have had their own healing practices. I like to tell people, my grandmother and my great grandmother, I don't even know how, but they didn't know yoga. My grandmother, great grandmother, nobody ever taught them mindfulness practices. They had this resilience and this extraordinary ability to heal. So we have to understand this. We must recognize it, and I think we have to really lift it up, while at the same time opening up the opportunity to really to allow the freedom of bringing in new things, bringing in new learnings, bringing in new knowledge, bringing in new techniques. We want to be open to that, but it's got to be integrated into the cultural traditions that really already are there.
So Father Paul, we have a couple people that have some comments, questions, and I know that I want to, Cissy, I know I can't find you. So Cissy.
She's on the next side. But I'm sorry to interrupt you, Erin, but Miss Celestina Edmonds asked to make a comment.
Sure.
Yeah. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
That would help.
There you go.
Thank you, Father Abernathy, for such a cogent and scholarly presentation regarding this very critical and essential topic of discussion. I could go on and on, but I will try to keep my comment very brief. I'm a speech language pathologist for 100 years, and I have worked with children diagnosed with emotional disturbance for over 40 years, and from a professional perspective as well as through my ministry. I'm new to this terminology, the trauma informed, and children who are experiencing trauma. That's one reason why I decided to come on this evening, to expand my knowledge base. But let me just say this, and I first and foremost commend you for you being bold, courageous, and speaking about your Christian faith, because I'm speaking to you from a Christian perspective in terms of the things that you have stated thus far. I'd like to present another perspective that I think is so essential, in that in my many years of working with children, the number one variable, we know there are multifaceted variables, factors that impact upon these children. And you did mention many, and of which I, being at the age of 64, I personally have experienced poverty, violence, all that you have stated. But in 1965, Patrick Moynihan made a statement that was at that time deemed to be racist, but he gave a dire warning and expressed grave concern regarding the issue of fatherlessness. And let me say that seems always to be the elephant in the room. And I believe because many people consider that to be a moral issue, an issue that can become judgmental. But when, in my experience again, and from the research, there's a plethora of research that talks about the number one, the first wound, the first trauma that children from low socioeconomic single parent households experience is the absence of the father, that has dire consequences in all variables, all dimensions of a child's life. And again, we talk about government policies. We have a myriad of solutions to address an issue. But again, the problem has to be addressed, again, as a believer, from the root of the issue, which is when there are choices being made to have children born in single parent households without a father parent. Children need both. And we can see the consequences. And again, the research, and this is not only from, again, a Christian perspective, it's from secular research studies as well, that we must begin to talk about and to address the first wound, the first trauma that many of these children experience, and that is the absence of a father. Thank you.
Well, Miss Celestina, if I may react, I really want to thank you for certainly your courage. These are very important dialogues that we must have. We look at really what the impact certainly of this is on our communities. As you're speaking, it reminded me of some of the statistics around, 1 in 3 Black boys born today, 1 in 3 can expect to go to prison. 1 in 3.
Yeah.
We know that our many of our Black communities, the statistic is essentially 1 in 6 Black men is just removed from the community, either through death or incarceration. I will tell you that I had referenced the Syrian civil war earlier, and hundreds of thousands. Now, in my lifetime, we have lost hundreds of thousands. I would say in my lifetime, 250,000 Black men have died from gun violence. Now, if this was another country in the world, we'd be saying this is genocide, but this is our own country. We have to understand that there is a deep impact that this has on our community, that this is shaping the worldview of our community. I remember it was at a slam poetry event years ago, and there was a Black mother, who she got up and she did a poem about her newborn Black son, and it was such a striking poem because I can't remember the it word for word, but really the gist of it was, I don't ask if he'll be, essentially a professor or a lawyer. I ask if he will be a prisoner or he'll die before he hits the age of 21. And I mean that is the challenge. This is the narrative that's been with us. And I will tell you that in the context of historical trauma, this is also extraordinarily important because, as we all know, whenever slaves were brought here, our ancestors were brought here in the Middle Passage. We all know that one of the ways in which they attempted to dominate the whole people is to concentrate on these men. And just to imagine what really it was like for these men on the plantation, even sometimes to have to endure the pain of seeing their wives raped by the slave owner. Incidentally, there's another sin that's been with us that has, I believe, had an extraordinary impact, and that is with the children of these slave owners. The children of these slave owners being themselves also slaves. I mean, can we imagine a world in which a man would have a child and make that child a slave? What is the impact on all of this? On how we relate to one another, on how we see one another? What is the impact on the nuclear human experience that has resulted from all of this trauma? We have to talk about it. Not only we have to talk about it, we have to start to heal from it. We have to also say that if it's not just about our past, if we can sit here and say statistically now that 1 in 3 of our beautiful children, 1 in 3 of them are going to be in prison, and this doesn't compel us to some kind of action, then we really have to examine ourselves.
Absolutely.
We have to be honest about this. And we have to also understand that from these experiences, the first understanding of how we relate to one another in the world, this nuclear family experience, has heavily impacted worldviews. and this we know, the worldview being set between the ages of 0 and 3, this we know. And I've been with so many children, like so many of us, who their fathers are incarcerated. So this will be my closing thought. There's so much to say, Miss Celestina, isn't there?
I know.
You know, this is my closing thought. I have a really I have great admiration for Secretary of Corrections for the state of Pennsylvania. His name's John Wetzel. He's African American, and he's made some extraordinary reform, and not only in corrections but also in parole. And obviously there's a lot left to do, but he really is committed to doing the work. But he said to me one day, he said, well, I'll tell you, one of the most powerful experiences is I was walking in the hall. He was speaking in the school, and he was walking in the halls, and this little kid, he said, he came up to him, and it was a girl, actually came up to him, and she said, "Hey, Mr. Wetzel, you know my dad." And he thought that he had maybe been working with his dad and her dad. And he said, "Oh, well, I don't know what's your dad's name." And she told her dad's name. He said, "Well, how would I know him? We're working with." She said, "Well, he's in one of your jails. He's in one of your jails." And you know, this experience is really so common. Another guy in corrections, he just recently told me that one of the most painful experiences of his life was whenever this newly incarcerated young Black man came on the prison yard. And he said that he came on the prison yard his first day in the prison yard, and he saw his grandfather in the prison yard. And he went over, and his grandfather, you know, embraced him, said, "Good to see you again." And just at that time, his grandfather said to him, "Hey, son, or hey, grandson, I want to introduce you to your father, who's also locked up here." His father, who he had never met, because shortly after he was born, his father was incarcerated. So he saw these 3 generations: grandson, son, and grandfather coming together. The grandson, the grandson meeting the son for the very first time in the prison yard. We Americans, the land of the free, and we have more prisoners than any other country in the world. Things have to change. And I will tell you, there are severe consequences for all of this. And I will tell you this, some of our communities have paid a heavy price for this already. So we must do better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you to both of you. That was incredibly powerful. And I think we could all many of us could stay a whole lot longer and just paying attention to time. So I have at least 2 more questions coming from the virtual audience. And the first that I have up is from Cissy. So I'm gonna have Cissy go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, this is so healing and wonderful, but I guess the question I wanted to ask is, how in your work do you center like the honesty and the healing and the pain enough to harness community expertise? And the reason I ask that is, like, there's someone on this here from Canada, Elizabeth Perry, and I know she's done great work trying to start like survivor-led initiatives. And a lot of times the door is shut because she's just a survivor, or she's coming from a place of pain and not clinical expertise. And unless she's working for a nonprofit or, you know, affiliated with some organization and presents as that way, she can't get heard. And I know that's true for a lot of people. And so I'm just wondering how exactly, like, I love your emphasis on making sure community members are experts in leading, but it seems really rare. So I guess I'm wondering, like, how to.
Right. Yes, absolutely. So this is a great question. Great question. I have it's interesting. So I'll tell you, here in Pittsburgh, some of my elders, they have been, they have been doing really powerful gun violence work for a long time. I mean, gun violence is bad now. Of course, back in the 90s, it was really spiking, as I'm sure some of us can remember. And there are some really incredible veterans from the days of that work. And what's so funny now is, and this is certainly not at all to knock Kim or the organization or the work, but But of course, now many people are familiar with Cure Violence and Dr. Carey Sipp, who's an epidemiologist, who spent time working on epidemics in Africa and then translated to this work to dealing with gun violence here at home. And of course, he's brilliant. And I ascribe this public health approach to gun violence, and it's very powerful. We know it to be very effective. But so what's interesting was I was with some of the elders in our community who had been working on gun violence since the days of the 90s, and they were all Black. You know, they had grown up in the hood, been in the hood, but they had been very effective, saved many lives, and all that. Worked with some really hard to reach young men. And one day they were somebody was introducing Dr. Slutkin's work to them, and one of them remarked, "Well, that sounds like what we've been doing since the 1990s." And it occurred to me that the difference between them and Dr. Slutkin is that Dr. Slutkin wrote his work down. And this is where we have the great disparity about there are those who are doing this work, and then those who have certain, the quote unquote qualifications. And that qualifications gives them the ability to, write it down and package it and own it and that type of thing, even though this work had been going on in communities for quite some time. So here's what for me, understanding that is a given reality. And I had the same conversation because, I'm not a clinician. I don't have that clinical background. I was a soldier and then went to graduate school and seminary, and now as a priest, I'm not really, I guess, quote unquote, qualified to do that, except that I love. I've learned that love is such a powerful qualification, and that love makes a remarkable teacher of us all. Because how did you learn this stuff about trauma? Well, if you love these people, you'll learn it. This is kind of how it goes. Well, I had the same experiences when I started talking about this. We want to talk about trauma-informed community development. And there were some people who they're saying, well, who qualified you to do this? I heard all the very same things from the funding community, especially, and other, and so I kind of responded jokingly in my own way. I didn't say it exactly like this. This is what I'm saying to you. This is what I was maybe thinking, maybe trying to say. It probably didn't come out this way. But my response to that was, well, they were saying to me, who qualified you to work in your own community? And my response was kind of, well, who qualified you to work in our community? I mean, you qualified yourselves to work in our community. So how we handled that was this. We understood there's value in coming together with people who have different particular expertise. But here really was the difference. The difference was this. Usually it was us going to sit at their table. But really in our case, what happened was they came to sit at our table. That the best way to ensure that you have a place at the table is to set the table yourself. Now I see on the call, Dr. Elisa Lopez-Lever is at that particular time, because she's a trauma expert. And one of the things I learned about her very quickly was that if I asked her to come into our community and sit at the table, that she was very willing to do that. Now, I know, being in this trauma-informed world, that there are many people with that expertise who are willing to do that and merely waiting for the invitation. I've learned that. I've also learned that you just don't need everybody. Because there's some folks that, if I can quote the scriptures, you got to shake the dust off your sandals and keep it moving. You don't need everybody, and it's not for everyone. But sometimes we just, there are so many people who are just waiting for the invitation. And the only thing we need to do is set the table. If we go in and with a degree of confidence and perseverance, we say, look, we have set this table in the community. We are inviting you to come and join us. And this is the dialogue. And we will find, if that's the question and that's the approach, we will find the right people. And those folks will help us gain the credibility until, like in the case tonight, we, having proved ourselves by our work in the community, have the credibility, that our work then speaks for itself.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, we are getting close to the end. So
one more. Can we have Carey?
Right.
Yeah.
So Carey Sipp is going to ask the next question, and then we'll turn to Whitney and do a wrap up. And if anybody has additional questions or, we'll hang out for a few more minutes. So there we go. Go ahead, Carey.
Great. Thank you so much. Father Abernathy, thank you so much for being with us. I've heard you on a CTIP call several months ago and just, oh my goodness, loved you so much. And we have a friend in common. He's not a friend that I've met in person, but the Reverend William Barber, who is a hero of mine. And I have been reading his work and sending him a little money as I could. And I have a special request to ask of you, and that is this, is that will you take ACEs science, now the science of adverse childhood experiences and positive childhood experiences, to Reverend Barber? May I go with you to take it to him? Because he has got the most amazing campaign going, and he is working so hard, and we've got to work hard because there are 250 voter suppression bills that are up in legislatures in 43 states that are going to try to silence people. And as he says, forward together, not one step back. If we don't get this forward together, but I believe that if the Reverend Dr. Barber and if Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis would talk the science that we are talking about, the damage that poverty and racism and what that does to children's developing brains, that they would get a lot more attention, and that they could, putting the science behind it will validate what they're saying so much more. So will you help me do that? May I help you do that? Can we do that? Can we do that?
Well, I will tell you, the first thing is I certainly appreciate the question, and I will say that I, like you, certainly poverty is bad. And we know that the allostatic load and the experience of concentrated poverty over time can cause these experiences, like these traumatic experiences, can have the same impact, the stressors, right? The strains rather, that we have in life. Now, all of that also said, we also know that, like in the case of so many of our immigrant communities, that people are poor, but they really raise up out of that poverty because there's that strong resilience that is there. And I really believe that, yes, the poverty is a major issue, and so much of it is a result of, for example, structural racism, that we have to talk about that. And yet at the same time, we also know that there are communities that have been in poverty that one generation later have been out of poverty, different than communities that have been in this cyclical generational poverty. And I will tell you that, and so often it is the case that trauma really is the distinguishing factor. These various traumas that, when incorporated with that poverty, of course, there are many poverty causes its own traumatic experiences, that it severely inhibits our ability to really grow if we don't have the right resilience, the right protective factors. So I very much am with you in that shift. Now, I will tell you, you give me too much credit, because I've been in the same room as Reverend Barber. I don't think he even knows who I am. But I'll tell you, if I come across him again, I'll certainly whisper in his ear, ACEs. We'll see what happens.
All right, that would be great. Well, I'm in the South, and I've lived in the racist South and watched horrible things happen to people I love, and I just want it to stop. And this is a way out. So thank you so much for your time and for this. It was profoundly wonderful. Thank you. Thanks,
you.
Cissy. Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Erin.
Okay, and with that, what an enlightening and invigorating and motivating and just special hour. I know that time is now just amorphous, especially in 2020 and 2021, but that flew by for me. I know I have about 1 million more wonderments I'd love to pass by you, Father Abernathy, but for the sake of time, I'll keep them to myself for now. I just want to extend our sincerest thank you to you for being present with us tonight. And thank you to our fabulous, engaged, and thoughtful audience for being with us as well. Please continue this conversation. Do not let this discussion and this energy and this momentum and this work end here. Sending love and strength to you all, inviting you to leave whenever you need to, passing it to Erin to take us out with a quick breathing exercise, and we'll be around for a few minutes after as well.
So echoing Whitney's statements and just acknowledging that while we just spent an incredible hour together with some amazing information sharing and story sharing, to close with, however you define it, a prayer, a mindful moment, a pause, and transitioning into your evening, the rest of your evening. So I invite you to just kind of focus on something, and then you can place your hands on your heart or your belly. And I'm just going to read a quick breathing exercise and a mantra that I'd like to share with everybody. So breathing in through the nose, breathing out through the mouth. Breathing in, feeling the lungs expanding. Breathing out, feeling a sense of letting go. Breathing in to feel the body getting fuller. Breathing out to feel the release of any tension. Breathing in, feeling alive and awake. Breathing out, feeling muscles relaxing. Breathing in that sense of fullness. Breathing out that unnecessary tension. Inhaling love. Exhaling kindness. Inhaling love. Exhaling kindness. And one more round. In through the nose and out through the mouth. And with that, thank you so very much to every single person that showed up tonight after probably a very, very long day. I know Father Paul, myself, Whitney, Robin, Cissy, we've all been engaged in some, a lot of trauma talk today. So I wish you all a great evening and restful days ahead. And then we'll just kind of hang out for a minute.
Thanks everybody for showing up.
Thank you so much. This was
Thank
wonderful. I feel as though I've been in the woods and I've stolen away for a bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you so much. This was very, very enlightening. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. It was, I was sitting here on LinkedIn trying to connect with some of you. The names were disappearing so quickly. I'm Susan. I'm from Yolo County. I just started the leadership role of the Resilient Yolo Network, but I am connected in social media with some of you. And
nice to see you, Susan.
Yes, you too. I was like, yay, she's here. Anyway, I'll let you guys get off of your Zooms. And Erin, I was trying to find you. I think I found so many different people. But by the way, Father Abernathy, thank you. Wonderful, riveting, jolting stories. And Erin, thank you for decompressing us at the end.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. And if you can find me on LinkedIn, I'm connected to some of the people, so I'm happy to connect.
Okay. Take care.
Take good care.
And I didn't say we are going to do a follow-up blog post, so we'll have this recorded and on a blog post. Father Abernathy, you are so quotable, and there's so many gems that it's going to be a long blog post.
It's just so good to be with all of you. I just so admire you, and I'm always humbled to be in your presence. And I certainly look forward to spending more time together in the days ahead.
Yeah. So, thank you, Father Paul, for just always bringing it to us. You know, there's there's a lot of, and you, when you were referencing the clinician piece and the yoga piece, I'm like, even though I'm both.
That wasn't you, Erin, by the way.
No. But even though we're both, like, I'm both of those, it's something that I continuously recognize, and trying to figure out other ways not to just identify as a clinician and a yoga teacher, because that's not how I practice my healing. Right. I do it through many other ways. So, I mean, it's always a great reminder that's not, I mean, people heal in the ways of their traditions, and that's something we need to do better as clinicians, as for me as a white American, but I am a daughter of an immigrant, and there's so many pieces to that, and tapping into the culture. And I'm going to be tapping into my culture tomorrow on St. Patrick's Day.
Yes. Yes. That's wonderful.
I'm not really, because I'm not even like the true Irish. I mean, I am actually a citizen of Ireland technically, but I'm not like going out and drinking at the pub. So, but
that's so exciting.
Yeah. So thank you for. I just really appreciate when others will share that information. So.
And also, Robin, I don't know if I thought of your niece when Father Abernathy was talking about gun violence. I don't know if you wanted to share anything, but I was thinking about your work, and also how central your insights have been as a family that's been impacted by gun violence, but also by somebody who works in Camden.
Yeah. No, I know it's late, and I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah, I first of all, I took 4 pages of notes. I just want you to know.
Please share.
There's so many quotes here, but I do have, I think a lot of us go into the work that we do from personal reasons, right? Mm-hmm. So my work is personal and professional as a school nurse in Camden, a very traumatized city, and as a daughter and an aunt of 2 survivors of mass shootings that happened 70 years apart. And my niece is a Parkland student. So when you spoke of, you're right. I mean, she was one of those kids that spoke out, and they learned a lot, though. They learned that their voice was heard when children, other children of communities of color's voices weren't heard. And I do feel like they reached out to some of those communities and gave them space to join them. I think we all learned a lot from the obvious privilege that the Parkland kids had in terms of getting media attention. Compared to my father, he was 12 years old in Camden, where I happened to work, when his family was killed, along with 13 people altogether. But so anyway, interesting, I ended up back in that city. And the whole idea of healing within the community and using the traditions of the community is something I learned by working in Camden. I work with a lot of undocumented families who come from so many different cultures. And, we come in, I mean, I've been there 20 years now, and I was that white, savior coming in to fix everyone and come from my comfy Cherry Hill, New Jersey suburban life and drive 12 miles to my work and then leave at the end of the day. But I stayed I'm still there 20 years later. And it takes that long for people to trust you.
That's right.
It takes that long. But anyway, I just learned so much from listening to you. I really felt when you talked about the empowered healers within the community, and reframing, we have to reframe. There's so much expertise among the community, and we ignore it and marginalize it and further traumatize people and then leave. So I just learned so much tonight, and I love these women. I love working with them. I love, just everything about being together. So it was beautiful.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Robin, and for your work, for staying 20 years, and how wonderful it's been to be with all of you tonight. I'm leaving our time tonight very, very hopeful.
Yay.
Yes, very hopeful indeed.
Thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah,
what
my
an
goodness.
honor.
A big
Long-time
honor.
admirer. It's so good to meet you.
So good to meet you too. I pray, I look forward to, I know Erin, we'll see each other like soon, probably.
And so Father Paul, let me just throw a little big, huge note to the National Trauma Campaign that we have.
Yes.
So all those amazing graphics that have information and resources, Whitney is the developer of them.
What?
Yeah.
Whitney has really contributed so much under on the lowdown, or however we say it these. I can't talk today, but
yeah, exactly.
the down low, not the lowdown.
The down low, yeah.
But
Whitney, that's amazing.
Yeah, Whitney has contributed so much work and effort and time into the National Trauma Campaign. So yeah, I thought you'd appreciate that.
Thank you so much for all of that. Thank you so much for all of that. We used to have one of our behavioral health community organizers. He would try to make his point, and he used to draw on paper, but then he would carry his coffee, and he never had a lid for his coffee, so he used to spill it all over the paper. And I remember one time I was trying to do this, and I thought to myself, we ought to get a graphic designer.
Sketches aren't doing it.
So, Whitney, this is very important work. So thank you so